The crime that should not exist, the age of piracy has long been wrapped in romance, painted with images of freedom, rebellion, and the open sea. But this myth collapses the moment a woman is placed at its center. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a female pirate was not merely a criminal. She was considered an impossibility, a violation of divine order and social law. The sea was imagined as a masculine domain, governed by hierarchy, violence, and obedience to empire. When a woman stood on a pirate deck with a blade in her hand, she did more than steal ships or defy kings. She shattered an idea that power depended on male control. This was the true crime that authorities could not forgive. Long before chains were fastened to wrists, judgment had already been passed in the minds of those who claimed to rule the world. Capture marked the end of illusion and the beginning of ritual. When naval patrols closed in and cannons fell silent, the fate awaiting female pirates was carefully prepared, not improvised. Their bodies were searched not only for weapons, but for proof of transgression, clothing deemed improper, scars that suggested violence, hair cut short like a man's. Each detail was recorded as evidence that something unnatural had occurred. To the empire, these women were not just lawbreakers. They were warnings. Their very existence threatened the fragile structure that kept sailors obedient, wives silent, and colonies fearful. A woman who chose the sea over submission could inspire others. And inspiration was more dangerous than piracy itself, from the moment they were dragged onto the decks of naval ships. Female pirates entered a world designed to erase them. They were isolated, guarded, and denied any claim to honor or motive. Male pirates could still be framed as enemies of the crown, but women were framed as moral contamination. Their stories were retold by captains, judges, and clerks who shaped the narrative to fit a single purpose: to prove that disorder had been defeated. There would be no heroic last stands in official records, no acknowledgement of skill or courage. What followed was not simply punishment, but transformation, turning a living person into an example meant to terrify. Across colonial ports, whispers spread faster than official proclamations. Crowds gathered not out of justice, but curiosity. People wanted to see the woman who dared to live like a man, who crossed boundaries that society had marked as sacred. Authorities understood this hunger and fed it carefully. They delayed proceedings, moved prisoners through public spaces, and allowed rumors to grow. Fear was cultivated slowly, like a ritual performed in stages. The woman in chains became less human with every step, reduced to a symbol of chaos that had to be destroyed. Yet beneath the spectacle lay something darker. These women were not being punished solely for what they had done, but for what they represented. Their capture was meant to reaffirm a world where power flowed in one direction only. What awaited them next was not justice, but a carefully choreographed descent, one that history would later soften, sanitize, or forget entirely. And as the doors of the courtroom closed and the sea disappeared behind stone walls, the true ordeal was only beginning. Asterisk courts without mercy. Courtroom was never a place of balance for captured female pirates. It was a stage where the outcome had already been decided. These trials, held in colonial outposts and naval strongholds, were swift, quiet, and stripped of any illusion of fairness. There were no juries of peers, no careful weighing of testimony, and no patience for explanation. Admiralty courts existed to protect empire, not truth. When a woman was brought before these judges, her presence alone was taken as proof of guilt. The charge of piracy could be read in a single breath, but the deeper accusation was unspoken. She had dared to step beyond her assigned place in the world. In the eyes of the court, that act required correction more than evidence ever could. Proceedings followed a cold and efficient rhythm. Witnesses were almost always men ship captains, naval officers. Sailors promised leniency for cooperation. Their words blended fact, rumor, and fear, forming a single narrative that portrayed the accused as violent, immoral, and corrupted beyond redemption. The woman herself was rarely allowed to speak freely. When she did, her words were treated as deception or madness. Education, intelligence, or leadership were twisted into further proof of danger. Silence condemned her, but speech condemned her faster. The court did not seek confession. It sought confirmation of what it already believed. Even the physical setting reinforced the imbalance. These courts were often held in fortified buildings, surrounded by armed guards and symbols of royal authority. Chains remained on wrists during testimony, a reminder that freedom was already gone. Judges sat elevated, distant, and unmoved, reading from statutes designed for speed, not mercy. The law allowed them to convict on minimal evidence, and they used that power without hesitation. For female pirates, there was no presumption of innocence, only the presumption of contamination. The law treated them as problems to be removed, not people to be judged. Some attempted to delay the inevitable through technicalities, pleading illness or pregnancy, grasping at the narrow gaps the system allowed. These pleas were examined not with compassion, but suspicion. Bodies were inspected, privacy denied, and dignity stripped away in the process. Even when delays were granted, they were temporary, offered not to save a life, but to postpone an execution until it could serve its purpose more effectively. Mercy was not absent from these courts. It was deliberately withheld. Outside the courtroom walls, news of the trial spread through taverns and markets, distorted and amplified. The woman on trial became a story before she became a sentence, her fate discussed as entertainment. Authorities allowed this because fear traveled faster than law. The trial itself was only one part of the punishment. By the time the verdict was spoken aloud, the crowd already knew the ending. And as the gavel fell, sealing a fate that had never truly been in question, the machinery of punishment began to move, carrying the condemned toward a spectacle designed to remind the world what happened to women who refused to obey. The theater of punishment did not begin at the gallows. It began long before, carefully staged and publicly displayed. Once a sentence was passed, the condemned woman was transformed into a living warning. Her body used to communicate a message far louder than words. Authorities understood that fear worked best when it was seen, heard, and remembered. She was marched through streets under armed guard, her movements slow and deliberate, giving crowds time to gather and stare. Chains clinked with every step, not merely to restrain her, but to announce her shame. People leaned from windows, whispered prayers, or shouted insults, each reaction feeding the ritual. The empire was not hiding its cruelty. It was presenting it at the place of punishment. Nothing was left to chance. Gallows were raised in visible locations, often near water or marketplaces, where the maximum number of witnesses could assemble. For pirates, execution was meant to erase rebellion, but for women, it carried an added purpose: to restore a social order they were accused of violating. The method of execution reflected this intent. Rather than swift death, authorities favored techniques that prolonged suffering. The short drop ensured slow strangulation, forcing the body to struggle, convulse, and submit in full view of the crowd. This was not an accident of technology. It was a choice. Pain was part of the lesson. Before the rope ever tightened, many women endured additional punishments designed to humiliate as much as harm. Public flogging was common, administered with brutal precision. Each strike tore skin and dignity alike, while officials counted aloud to ensure the spectacle followed the sentence exactly. The crowd watched in silence or excitement, learning where defiance led. For women, this exposure carried a deeper cruelty. Their suffering was sexualized, moralized, and used to reinforce ideas of obedience and control. The punishment was never just for piracy. It was for stepping outside obedience. Even after death, the performance often continued. Bodies were sometimes left hanging for days, exposed to weather, birds, and tides. This practice served a chilling purpose. Sailors passing by would see what awaited them if they followed the same path. Communities would be reminded daily of imperial power. For a woman, the message was even sharper. Not only would rebellion be crushed, but it would be displayed until all memory of dignity was stripped away. Death was not the end. It was an extension of punishment, yet hanging was not the only outcome. Some women were spared immediate execution, not out of mercy, but convenience. Authorities understood that living prisoners could still serve the empire in other ways. As crowds dispersed and the gallows stood empty, new doors opened behind prison walls. Those who stepped away from death did not step toward freedom. They stepped into fates quieter, longer, and often far more cruel. And as the rope was untied and the crowd moved on, the true disappearance of these women was only beginning. When death was delayed for some captured female pirates, the gallows did not claim them immediately, but this delay was not a gift. It was a transformation of punishment from spectacle to silence. Once removed from public view, these women entered a shadowed world where records grew thin and suffering became private. Colonial authorities often decided that execution was unnecessary when a body could still be used. In these moments, the law shifted from punishment to possession. A woman who had once taken what she wanted from the sea was now treated as something that could be taken in return. Across colonial ports, officials quietly reassigned these women to new fates. Some were forced into hard labor, scrubbing docks, hauling supplies, or working in warehouses under constant guard. Others were sold or transferred as servants, their past erased and replaced with new names and false histories. For women of African or indigenous descent, the outcome was even more severe. Their capture as pirates blurred easily into enslavement, as authorities chose convenience over truth. Whether they had wielded weapons or been taken aboard ships unwillingly mattered little. Their bodies were absorbed into systems of bondage already thriving under empire. The violence of this transition was rarely recorded. Unlike executions, forced labor and concubinage left no dramatic images behind. Women vanished into private homes, plantations, and military compounds, where obedience was enforced through isolation and fear. Resistance did not end, but it became invisible. Attempts to escape were punished swiftly, ensuring silence spread faster than hope. In these spaces, time itself became a weapon. Days blurred together, eroding identity and memory. The sea that once symbolized freedom became a distant rumor, replaced by walls, commands, and exhaustion. Some women were deliberately kept alive to serve as examples within prisons. Their presence reminded others of what happened to those who challenged authority. Shackled and weakened, they stood as warnings stripped of heroism. Guards and officials exercised unchecked power, knowing that no one beyond the walls was watching. Abuse flourished where documentation failed. These women were not sentenced to death, but to erasure. Their lives stretched into long punishments without endings. This delayed destruction served imperial needs well. It avoided public sympathy, minimized attention, and extracted value from captured bodies. The empire did not simply kill its enemies. It repurposed them. By removing female pirates from the narrative entirely, authorities ensured that future generations would struggle to find their traces. Their stories dissolved into silence, leaving behind only rumors and fragmented references in forgotten ledgers. What history remembers as mercy was often a deeper cruelty. These women survived, but survival itself became a form of punishment. And as years passed and records faded, their existence slipped further into obscurity, setting the stage for the final disappearance that awaited them, one that did not require ropes or crowds. Only time and neglect, asterisk prisons that erased names for those who were neither executed nor quietly absorbed into forced labor. Another fate waited beyond the reach of public memory. Along the coasts of Britain and its colonies, old warships were stripped of sails and purpose, then anchored permanently in harbors as floating prisons. These hulks became the final destination for many captured pirates, rebels, and undesirables. For women, being sent to these vessels meant entering a world designed not to reform or punish openly, but to slowly erase existence itself. There were no crowds, no trials, and no witnesses-only confinement and decay. Below deck, conditions defied endurance. The air was thick and unmoving, poisoned by rot, human waste, and disease. Light barely reached the lower holds, where prisoners were chained in cramped rows, unable to stand fully or lie down without touching another body. Food was scarce and often spoiled, water foul and rationed. Illness spread unchecked, turning minor wounds into death sentences. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox moved through the ship like invisible executioners. For women, this environment carried added vulnerability. Privacy did not exist, and protection was an illusion. Guards ruled these vessels with near total authority. Abuse went unrecorded, dismissed as rumor or ignored entirely. Women endured exploitation that never appeared in official logs, their suffering reduced to silence by the very system meant to contain them. Complaints had nowhere to go, and survival depended on submission. Some prisoners disappeared suddenly, their absence explained by illness or transfer, though no destination was ever listed. Deaths were noted without detail, if they were noted at all. Many names were never written down, vanishing from history as if they had never lived. Time aboard these ships moved differently. Days blended into one another, marked only by hunger and exhaustion. The sea outside remained visible through narrow gaps, close enough to smell, yet forever unreachable. For women who once sailed freely, this proximity was a constant torment. The ocean became a reminder of what had been lost and what would never return. Their identities as pirates, sailors, or rebels dissolved, replaced by numbers or nothing at all. These prison ships served a purpose beyond confinement. They allowed the empire to remove troublesome figures without creating martyrs. Executions provoked memory. Disappearance erased it. By keeping women hidden and undocumented, authorities ensured that their stories would not inspire others. What could not be seen could not be remembered. Silence became policy. When bodies were finally removed from these ships, they were often buried without markers or disposed of quietly at sea. No ceremonies followed, no records preserved their names. The punishment was complete not when life ended, but when memory did. And in this deliberate forgetting, the empire achieved one of its most effective acts of control, turning defiant women into shadows. And shadows into nothing at all. Why history tried to forget them. The disappearance of female pirates from history was not an accident of time. It was a decision shaped by power. Empires that ruled through fear understood something essential about memory. What is remembered can inspire, and what inspires can threaten control. The stories of women who defied the sea's unwritten laws challenged the foundation of authority more deeply than cannons or stolen gold ever could. These women proved that obedience was learned, not natural, and that freedom could be claimed even in the harshest worlds. That truth was far more dangerous than piracy itself. Official records tell a carefully curated story. They list crimes, sentences, and outcomes with cold efficiency, while omitting suffering, resistance, and humanity. When women appear in these documents, they are reduced to curiosities or footnotes, stripped of motive and voice. Their actions are framed as abnormalities, never as choices. By presenting them this way, history transforms rebellion into error and courage into deviation. Silence becomes a tool, ensuring that future generations inherit a version of the past that feels orderly and inevitable. Yet fragments remain. Court transcripts hint at defiance. Marginal notes reveal hesitation. Archaeological traces, rusted chains, decayed ships, unmarked graves tell stories that words refuse to preserve. Modern historians, reading between the lines, have begun to uncover what was deliberately concealed. These women were not anomalies lost to chaos. They were systematically erased because their existence contradicted the narratives empire depended on. Their punishment extended beyond death or imprisonment into something far more permanent: historical absence. This erasure reshaped how piracy itself is remembered. Tales of male pirates survived because they could be romanticized, turned into legends of violence and freedom without threatening social order. Female pirates could not be safely mythologized in the same way. Their stories carried questions about gender, power, and choice that authorities preferred to bury. Forgetting them was easier than explaining them. And so, the sea kept their secrets while history looked away. What remains is a haunting absence, a silence where voices should be. These women did not vanish because they were insignificant, but because they were too significant to be remembered honestly. Their lives exposed the fragility of systems built on hierarchy and fear. Even now, their shadows linger in the gaps of historical records, challenging us to ask who decides what is worth remembering. In the end, the fate of captured female pirates reveals more about the world that judged them than about the women themselves. It exposes how power punishes not only the body, but the story, and how forgetting can be the most enduring sentence of all.